And that was really crucial, actually, because what if I didn't find a match between the DNA from Michael Ebson and the skeletal remains? How do we know it's not just because the tree isn't right?
Back in 2012, the discovery of King Richard III beneath a parking lot was supposed to close a 500-year-old mystery. But in 2025, a new round of DNA testing blew it wide open. What scientists uncovered wasn't just a damaged spine or proof of identity. It was evidence that the royal bloodline itself was broken by a secret affair generations ago. If the genetics are right, the English crown may have belonged to the wrong family all along, turning British history into less of a legend and more of a cold case crime scene built on a lie. Unmasking the royal fraud of 2025. The discovery of a king under a parking lot in Leicester sounds like the start of a strange movie, but it's 100% real. For over 500 years, nobody knew where the last English king to fall in battle was buried. Richard III met his end at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. After his defeat, his enemies took his body, showed it off to prove he was gone, and threw him into a basic grave. Over time, a church was built, then torn down, and eventually the spot became a boring city council parking lot. It stayed that way until 2012 when archaeologists decided to dig a hole and see if the legends were true. They didn't just find a skeleton. They found a secret that was so massive the scientists in 2014 didn't even want to fully explain it to the public. They found that the king had a severe curve in his spine which matched the stories of him being a hunchback. But the real story wasn't about his back, it was about his blood.
Basically non-stop cajoling, non-stop begging in some places.
When they tested his DNA against living relatives, something went wrong. The maternal side matched perfectly, but the male side was a total mess. It was a mismatch that suggested someone in the royal family tree had been unfaithful. This wasn't just a little bit of gossip. It was a genetic bomb. If the male line was broken, it meant the kings who followed might not have had a right to the throne at all. For 10 years, the experts called it an unsolved mystery and moved on. But here's the catch. In 2025, new technology has allowed scientists to go even deeper into the genetic code. They've reanalyzed the bones and compared them to even more ancient samples from the same family tree. The results are finally in, and they're much more disturbing than what we were told a decade ago. It turns out the original team revised their findings because the truth would have delegitimized an entire era of British history. Basically, the person everyone thought was the father of the dynasty wasn't the father at all. This means the entire House of York, including Richard III and his brother Edward IV, were not who they claimed to be. They weren't just kings. They were the result of a hidden affair that stayed secret for half a millennium. This new 2025 data proves that the break in the line happened right at the top. The guy who started the whole war over who was the rightful king was actually illegitimate himself.
Yeah, strangely, I am. Actually, I feel sick, which is a bit weird, isn't it?
It's the kind of twist that makes you question everything you learned in school. The blood proves a lie that changed the world forever. Most people thought the search for Richard III was a total waste of time and money. For centuries, the rumor was that his bones had been dug up and thrown into a river. But one woman named Philippa Langley had a hunch. She spent years looking at old maps and felt that the king was still there, right under the city. In August of 2012, they finally started digging. They cut a trench about 6 feet wide and 50 feet long into the asphalt of a parking lot. On the very first day, they hit human remains. It was a stunning moment that nobody expected. The skeleton was labeled as Skeleton 1. And it looked like it belonged to a man who had a very rough time. The grave was too short, which meant the head was propped up at a weird angle. This wasn't a burial for a royal hero. It was a quick job done by people who wanted him forgotten. As they cleaned the bones, the story got even darker. The man had 11 injuries. Most of them were to his head. It looked like he'd been surrounded and struck down after his helmet was lost in the chaos of the fight. One injury was so bad it went straight through the top of his skull. But the most famous detail was the spine. It had a massive curve that would have made his right shoulder look much higher than his left. This was the proof they needed. The king, who had been called a monster for 500 years, actually had a real medical condition called scoliosis. Everything seemed to fit perfectly. They had the location, the wounds, and the physical deformities. But they still needed the DNA to be sure. They took a tooth and a piece of the leg bone to a high-tech lab. They needed to find a living relative to see if the codes matched. They found a man in London who was a descendant of the king's sister. The maternal DNA was a match. The world cheered because a lost king had been found. But while everyone was celebrating, the scientists were looking at the other half of the DNA, the part that comes from the father. That's when things started to get really uncomfortable for the researchers. The king was found, but his father's ghost was about to cause trouble. Why the 2014 study was revised. When the results for the male line came back in 2014, the scientists were in a tough spot. They tested the Y chromosome, which is passed down from father to son. They compared Richard's DNA to 5 men who were supposed to be his distant cousins. If everything was legitimate, they should have shared the same genetic markers, but they didn't. There was a total mismatch. It was a genetic impossibility for them to be from the same male line. This meant that at some point in the 19 generations between the king and the modern relatives, a child was born from an affair but raised as a legitimate heir. The scientists realized this was a massive scandal. If the affair happened before Richard III, then he had no right to be king. If it happened even earlier, then his entire family was fraudulent. So here's the deal. Instead of telling the world that the royal bloodline was a fake, the 2014 team was very careful with their words. They said the break could have happened anywhere in the 500 years. They didn't want to point fingers or cause a constitutional crisis. They basically revised the impact of the discovery to make it sound like a curious little mystery.
The whole skeleton underneath, but these bones are on top.
Yes, we think it's quite likely that this skull is actually not associated with the skeleton underneath.
They focused on the fact that they'd found the body and pushed the paternity scandal into the background. They knew that if they proved the break was early in the tree, it would mean the current royal family might not have a solid link to the ancient kings. It was just too big of a risk to take back then. Everyone was obsessed with the miracle of finding the bones, so the mismatch was treated like a footnote. But that footnote was actually the most important part of the whole story. It was the evidence that the history of England was built on a foundation of secrets. Now, we're seeing that those secrets couldn't stay buried forever. The official story was safe, but the truth was ticking like a bomb. The rumors of illegitimacy weren't new in 2025. Even back in the 1400s, people were whispering about the House of York. There was a famous story that Richard's mother, Cecily Neville, had a secret lover while her husband was away at war. People claim that Richard's brother, King Edward IV, was actually the son of a handsome archer from France. At the time, everyone thought this was just nasty talk to make the king look bad. But the new 2025 DNA analysis has looked at the markers with way more precision. They used something called long-read sequencing to look at the entire genome. They also got permission to test other ancient samples from the royal vaults. And get this, the new data shows that the Y chromosome of the House of York doesn't match the rest of the Plantagenet line at all. It means the rumor about the archer might have been right all along. The break didn't happen in the 1900s or 1800s. It happened right there in the middle of the most important war in English history. This changes everything. It means the Wars of the Roses, which lasted for 30 years and took out thousands of people, was fought over a lie. The House of York claimed they should be in charge because their blood was purer than the House of Lancaster. But science is now telling us that their blood wasn't royal at all. Richard III took the throne by claiming his nephews were illegitimate, but he likely knew that he was illegitimate too. The irony is just incredible. He was obsessed with bloodlines and loyalty, yet his own existence was proof of a betrayal. This 2025 revelation is hands down the biggest historical correction we've ever seen. It's not just about one man in a parking lot. It's about how a single secret affair can change the fate of a whole country for centuries. A secret romance in a castle destroyed a dynasty hundreds of years later. Living with a history built on lies. Let's just really talk about this down to earth for a second. Imagine being a king and spending your whole life fighting for a crown because you believe it's your birthright. You go to war, you lose your friends, and you eventually lose your life on a field in the middle of nowhere. Then, 500 years later, some people in lab coats dig you up and prove that you weren't even supposed to be there. The thing is, this happens more often than we think. In the past, there were no DNA tests. A woman's word was the only way to know who a father was. If a queen or a duchess had a secret, she took it to her grave.
He'd actually gone to the site of the Blackfriars Priory, and no wonder then that he couldn't find Richard's tomb, because he was looking in the wrong place.
But now, the graves are opening up and telling the truth. We're missing key details if we just look at the dates and the names in history books. We have to look at the people and the risks they took. This 2025 discovery makes us wonder if anything in history is actually true. If a whole dynasty can be based on a lie, what else are we wrong about? The scientists have shown us that the bloodline we've been told about is a complete fiction. It makes you think about the power of a secret and how long it can last. Richard III was buried under a parking lot, but his secrets were buried even deeper. Now that they're out, we have to rethink the entire story of the British monarchy. It's a wild ride that proves science is the ultimate historian. No matter how much you try to hide the truth, The genetic code doesn't forget. This is the end of the line for the old version of history. We're living in a new world where even kings can't hide from their own DNA. The crown was real, but the blood was a clever fake. The crazy part is that this doesn't just affect the past. It ripples all the way to the present day. If the line was broken back in the 1400s, it means every king and queen who came from that specific branch had a questionable claim. Now, obviously, the current royal family won't lose their jobs over this. History has a way of moving on and making new rules. But from a purely genetic standpoint, the mystery is solved. The 2025 data is the final word on the matter. It's the most disturbing part of the whole journey because it shows that human nature is the same, whether you're a peasant or a king. People have affairs, people lie, and people protect their power at all costs. Richard III was a man of his time, but he was also a victim of a system that cared more about blood than about the truth. Finding him was a miracle, but knowing the truth about him is a burden. It changes how we see the Battle of Bosworth and the end of the Middle Ages. It wasn't just the end of a king. It was the end of a lie that had been told for generations. The parking lot is empty now, and the king is buried in a cathedral, but the scandal is more alive than ever. It's a reminder that the truth always finds a way out, even if it takes half a millennium and a lot of digging. Is it possible that every royal family in the world is hiding a similar genetic secret that would change history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments because this is a total game changer. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal scandal of 2025, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Unsealed Prophecy for more revelations.